to the Friends of St Mary's Friends Forum. This is, of course, the first time that we've held this particular meeting on Zoom, and so my first plea must be for you to bear with us as we find our way through the Zoom maze. We've all got used to Zoom in the course of the year, but please bear with us if there are some hiccups in the events this evening. My co-host is Dave Broughton, and I'm really grateful to Dave for all his help with setting up this and various other Friends of St Mary's projects, and really endless good cheer and good humour, and lots of patience, all of which are essential qualities for dealing with Zoom meetings. This year I'm quite new to being chair of the Friends of St Mary's, and one of the things I had to do this year was compile the annual report, and I started looking through older editions of the annual report to see what I should do, and I saw that the Friends Forum was, over the years, was very much focused on contemporary events. There were a number of presentations about the environment and various other big issues of the day. And I was thinking, obviously, this year, the big issue of the day is the coronavirus pandemic, and that we should find a way to take a look at that coronavirus pandemic, which has affected all our lives so very dramatically over the past year, and that it would be especially good to do this with a society based in Oxford, since Oxford has played such a major role in the principally in the development of the vaccine, but is a really great medical centre for investigating the pandemic. And so that is our subject this evening. Before I talk about the speakers, I'm just going to do a little guide to the etiquette of Zoom this evening. So when we start our programme, it would be really helpful if everyone mutes themselves, turn off the speakers, and if you don't do it yourself, then I have to tell you that Dave will do it for you. And also, if you turn off your camera, then we can focus the bandwidth, as it were, on our speakers, and that would be helpful too. We have two very different presentations this evening, so I'm proposing to invite you to put questions to each of our speakers in turn. So there'll be, if there are any questions or observations for Phil, who's going to be our first speaker, Phil Whiting, then we'll have a question session immediately after his presentation. And then I have every confidence that there will be lots of questions for Emily Williams, our second speaker. And so we'll have another session after Emily's presentation. But if you've got something that you'd like to ask Phil that you didn't remember to do after he's finished speaking, then it will, of course, be okay to ask him at the very end. So for the questions, you will see at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a function called chat, and you can type your question into the chat. If you click on chat, you'll see a little box to type your question in, which you can do, and then you just press enter and send it off. If you would rather speak and ask your question in person, then simply type question into the chat box and press enter, and then I'll know where you are. So I'm going to do the chairing, and Dave is going to be the bouncer. The other job that Dave is doing this evening is recording, and that's another reason for muting everybody but the speakers, because if you've got your sound on, then we're going to get a lot of background noise on the recording, and we don't want that. The advantage of recording the presentations is that Dave can then post them in due course when they've been tidied up and edited a little bit. It can be posted on the Friends of St. Mary's website, and so it will be possible for our friends who weren't able to be with us this evening to see the presentations on the website in due course. I think the only other thing I had to say was that if you want to see the speaker in full screen mode while they're speaking, or indeed Emily's PowerPoint, I think all you need to do is double click on the image to make it full screen. So I think that's all the management I have to say. I'm sure Dave will correct me if I've forgotten anything.
No, perfect, perfect.
Thank you. So the title of this evening's programme is Coronavirus, the Personal and the Medical, Two Contrasting Journeys Through Aspects of the Pandemic in Oxford and Beyond. And our two speakers are Phil Whiting, who is the treasurer of the Friends of St. Mary's. Now, I wouldn't want to suggest that in any way Phil goes in for creative accounting, but in every other aspect of Phil's life, he is an enormously creative person. I mean, he's really amazing. And I'm sure many, if not all of you, will be familiar with his paintings. We put a very small version of a very recent painting, Over the Marshes and Far Away, Wild Geese at Ockmore, which he painted only, I have now to say it's December the 1st, it was last month, November. A really wonderful picture, and there have been many of these through the pandemic. But I can also tell you that Phil is a poet. In fact, he's a very skilled poet, and we've enjoyed an email correspondence of verse through the pandemic. It's been great fun. And he's also been, and this is really important for our subject, he's one of the many great volunteers on the Oxford Astra Zeneca vaccination programme. So Phil is someone who's made a personal contribution to our way out of this pandemic. And I'll return in a moment to the subject of his contribution, but just to mention our second speaker, Emily Williams, whom many of you will know as the very able and energetic manager of the Iffley community shop. But before Emily took on this onerous task, she was a retired paediatric consultant anaesthetist, which I'm sure was a doddle compared to managing the Iffley community shop. But she is actually an expert in ventilation, which of course is also has also been a major aspect of the story of this pandemic. And that's what we're going to hear about. Secondly, first of all then, we're going to hear Phil Whiting. I feel I'm in the wrong room of my house. I should be downstairs with the piano and the Noel Coward songbook, Mad Dogs and Englishmen Go Out in the Midday Sun. But this is just a very slight variation on that theme. Mad Dogs and an Englishman Go Out in the Midday Sun. over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Susan. Very, very kind words. Thank you very much. I must say it's a real privilege for me to be invited to read my prose poem, Mad Dogs and an Englishman Go Out in the Midday Sun on Friends Forum. So a big thank you all for joining the event on Zoom, and a special thank you for Friends of St. Mary's Chair, Susan Walker, and IT expert Dave Broughton for making this year's Friends Forum happen. For those of you who don't know me, suffice it to say that I am by profession a landscape painter, primarily concerned with issues around memory, history, post-conflict, loss, and human rights. This prose poem resulted from an hour's walk I made on a particularly hot day in early September this year, from the Churchill Hospital to my home on the Ifley borders. It contains flashbacks to experiences I've had in several hot climate areas of the world whilst working as an artist. Like lots of men, the last place I would choose to go would be a hospital. So on a particularly hot Sunday afternoon in early September, why did I, a perfectly healthy 72-year-old male, willingly find myself the subject of medical attention sitting in a hospital annex cubicle? I had volunteered to be a participant in the Oxford COVID-19 vaccine trial, staged in a purpose-built unit outside the Jenner Centre, an appendage at the bottom end of the Churchill Hospital complex. I was here to receive my second vaccination, a booster to the first I had been given 3 weeks earlier. Emma, my wife, drops me off in the small car park. It's hot, dusty, the sun blazing down. I don my mask, give my number to a masked security attendant who nods me up a ramp into the prefabricated annex behind. The world changes. I'm on a carousel, sucked into a regimented maelstrom of masked figures, needles, and form signing. I'm disembodied, gliding from cubicle to cubicle, until finally, armed with 2 paper carrier bags containing swab kits, I'm ejected out the other side into the heat of the day. I'm a child again at Hull Fair, sitting on the little train entering the booth that promises the trip of a lifetime to the outer limits of the universe. Swishes, bangs, planets and moons, images distorted by mirrors, flash by before I crash through a trapdoor back out into the world. I want to take my mask off, breathe in the fresh air, and walk back to Ifley. I edge my way down through waste bins, piled high with hospital detritus packed in plastic bags, some bursting their contents onto the ground. I climb through a broken fence and join a footpath snaking through overgrown wasteland to woods below. The woods are shaded heaven away from the heat of the sun. I follow the footpath bearing right. Something is strange. I pass figures, mainly male, standing silently in the shadows waiting. I've entered the cottage world. But am I not fortified against seediness, armed with my carrier bags, my badges of honour, a knight errant ready to put right the wrongs of the world? Every epidemiologist will tell you that good management is half the battle against pandemics, the other half of the battle being vaccine. Flashback to 1980. AIDS has spread out of Africa, contaminating Haiti, playground for American West Coast gays. It spreads in through the West Coast, infecting the whole of America and the Western world. It is wrongly seen as a gay disease. It's only after the death toll reaches 14,000 in America and is clearly infecting the wider non-gay community, especially Black ghetto areas, that President Reagan feels compelled to act. Protection through education becomes the motto. Teams of medics and educators are sent into black ghetto areas, but soon find themselves ignored, even as the death rate rises exponentially. The reason being that most of the medics and educators are middle-class white, and as such are seen to have no right whatsoever to tell black people how to behave sexually. My pace quickens. I avoid stepping into dog shit and I use sanitary towel. I'm out of the woods and into the sun. I'm hot, flustered, sweating, and lost. I'm walking along the edge of a housing estate, a run-down neighborhood with overgrown front gardens. There's no one about. I'm back in Lebanon, stepping over shattered pavements, plastered in litter and plastic waste. I'm looking up through a tangle of fencing to the burnt-out Palestinian refugee camp. Black and brown girders twist and point accusingly, a shrieking silhouette against a blue Mediterranean sky. The heat grows more intense. I walk on. A dog barks, and children's voices can be heard. I pass a gap in a fence and catch sight of two disheveled figures crouching over a bubbling pan, snorting crystal meth. I'm in a town called Tecate, on the wrong side of the narco border. I've been in the desert for days now and have lost my journal and my sketchbooks. I'm distraught, tired, and in need of a drink. I hear music. It's an old number by the Dave Clark Five. It must be coming down from a bar down the alleyway round the corner. A woman is sitting on the ground, her back propped against the wall in the shade. As I step by, her eyes meet mine, a lazy look. It's too hot to bargain, too hot to do anything. Relax, enjoy your drink. Tranquilo, senor. But I'm not in Mexico, I'm here in Oxford, and the enormity of the situation hits me. Urgent, desperate times. A deadly pathogen is spreading everywhere, worldwide, creeping into every nook and cranny. Following massive deforestation, it crept out into the opening, jumping species and seeking other hosts, other forms of life to feed on. I take a footpath around the back of some new builds, raised voices, a door slams, and then silence. The smell of a barbecue, and then the smell of ganja, thick and sickly. Somewhere, the sound of children playing. I'm in the trees again, stepping around an abandoned shopping trolley, and nearby, a pile of rotting sleeping bags, and the remains of a tent caught up in thick foliage. I break out of the trees and descend an embankment onto a busy road. The noise is shocking, waking me out of somnambulism. Cars flash by, overtaking each other, screaming and roaring, A to B as fast as possible in a straight line. The geometry of greed, the geometry of insanity. Horizon setting a compass upon the face of the earth. The dual carriageway lines pointing south and north, converging on vanishing points far away. I get my bearings. I'm no longer lost in space, head south on the tarmacked footpath alongside the eastern bypass. It's so hot the tarmac is melting beneath my feet. Across the dual carriageway, the Cowley mini plant emerges, a pale temple shimmering in the heat. A cyclist approaches, growing ever larger. She glides past, grunting, breathing hard, a glimpse of mask, helmet, deranged eyes, and she's gone. Across the road, in the plant, the robots, COVID-free, wait like praying mantis, their artificial intelligence ready to take over the world. This is a future, no compassion, no empathy, insentient, regimented beings. Survival is all. I reach a road junction and wait for instructions from the lights to cross. But the robots have decided to sow confusion among humankind. Green, amber, green, flicker, red. It's every person for themselves. I dart across, clutching my swab bags, challenging the robots and cursing their immutability. I cut off to the right and cross a grassed recreation area, passing sunbathing figures, lumps of flesh stretched out on the grass. And then I'm walking down a quiet street with semi-detached houses and cars parked along the curb. A figure walks directly towards me down the center of the road. He is a well-known local character, a schizophrenic, disheveled, and threatening. He stops abruptly, bawls out and curses the sky. He turns and walks the other way. I'm walking in the heat of the day through a remote hill village. A rabid dog approaches, snarling, saliva dripping from its fangs. I hear the voice of Calden the Sherpa. Walk straight ahead. Do not hesitate. Dogs are sacred in Nepal. I look round. There is no one there. And the dog too has vanished, disappeared into thin air. Anubis ushering souls into the afterlife. I'm approaching the Ifli borders, Cortland Road, and my home. I walk through our front garden gate and open the front door with my latch key. I'm hot, sweating, and disorientated. Are you all right? Is it the vaccine? Asked a horrified Emma. No, it was just a walk home, out there, beyond our little bubble. It's a bit too hot, I reply. Right, thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Phil. That's quite a journey, and most extraordinary evocation of this and other pandemics and the alienation they bring. I hope it wasn't the vaccine. And
I suspect it was actually.
You think it was, right? Okay. So also at this point, it's always so difficult to imagine a very hot day when the weather's turned so wintry. But thank you very much. That was an extraordinary evocation. I can't see any questions for you in the chat function. Are there any questions for Phil? Juliet, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Hi, Phil.
Hi, Juliet.
Hi, Phil. Yeah. Did you have any further strange reactions? If this could have been caused by COVID, did you have other? I mean,
none or two.
By the vaccine, did you have any other sort of out-of-body experiences?
No more than normal. No, actually, the vaccine has been, for me, it's been totally harmless. I did pick up COVID, interestingly enough, about 6 weeks ago, and literally, I think the vaccine, I was asymptomatic because every week we have to take a swab test. And to my great shock, one of them came back positive. And I was totally asymptomatic, and so was Emma, my wife. We were perfectly okay, didn't have any effects. So of course, I had to phone a Jenner sensor and sort of, you know, as is part of the process. Of course, they were amazingly interested about that. And they did send a special courier around to take, shall I say it, stool samples, which were then taken to Heathrow and flown to Wisconsin, to a laboratory in Wisconsin. in Wisconsin. And anyway, the next week's swab test came back negative, but we had to self-isolate for 10 days. And you know, I think they were interested because, as far as I can understand, they need possibly 150 people worldwide to catch COVID after they've been given the vaccine, so they can see whether it works or not. Because the vaccine really is not so much of a preventive measure; it's more a mitigation.
Do you still have follow-ups?
Sorry, what do you mean?
Followed up by them?
Every week we write a diary. So we take the swab on the Friday, and on the Saturday we do a week's diary. And this will continue for 12 months. It's literally a commitment until probably early autumn next year.
And when will you know if you had the actual vaccine or the placebo?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I could be given the placebo, which in England is meningitis. In Brazil, it literally is a saline thing. It doesn't do anything. But here it's a meningitis. And the reason it's a meningitis vaccine is that it's very, very similar in reaction on people to the COVID vaccine. So you don't know whether you're reacting to the COVID or the meningitis, and neither do the scientists. Now, the interesting thing is that it's all done by numbers. So I've got a special number. Now that special number, which identifies me as one of the participants, goes into a Fort Knox-like box on a computer, and nobody has access to that number, not scientists or anything. And the only time they will get access to that number is when the vaccine comes out, or a vaccine comes out, and I'm called to have a vaccine. So I'll go along to my GPs, and what will happen there is that I will tell the GP I've been on the trial. He will phone up the Jenner Centre with my special number, and then they can unlock to see whether I've been given the vaccine or not. And it has to be done like that, obviously, because they don't want any, it's laboratory conditions, basically. So I could be going along now thinking I've had the vaccine and I'm fine and everything else, and then find that I haven't and at risk. So I still live my life, as anybody else would who's sensible. I.e., keep to the restrictions and just be sensible. Yeah.
Well, you have a question from Anna.
Yeah. The fact that you actually had caught the virus, how was it explained to you? I mean, since you were, given the vaccine, you should have been kind of immune. Does that mean that it doesn't work?
You could have asked for your money back, Phil.
What money? That's a problem, The fact is, from what I've heard, there was I think it was about 137 people were given the vaccine worldwide that caught COVID. And out of the 137, they found, I might be slightly wrong here, but it's more or less the same numbers. I think something like 48 were seen to be given the vaccine. So they're working on that number.
Okay.
And I think possibly, yeah. And as we speak, there's more and more statistics coming through all the time.
Yeah. So basically, you could have been one who wasn't being given the vaccine, proper, but a substitute.
I could have been one who was given the meningitis. That's right. But obviously, they've checked it out because they wouldn't know. So they will know whether they've given me the vaccine or not, or my number's been given the vaccine.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
Yeah.
they wouldn't have come up with that figure.
Yeah.
Phil,
I like to think I've had the vaccine.
Yeah. Yes, I think you probably do need to think that at this point. You've got a lot of applause, Phil, from Bruce and Sally. I can see a row of clapping hands on the chat page, which is very nice.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much indeed. And I think we'll move on now to our second presentation, which, as I mentioned earlier, is by Dr. Emily Williams, who, before retiring to the Iffley Community Shop, was a paediatric consultant anaesthetist. And as we will all know, the whole business of breathing and ventilation is absolutely central to the experience of coronavirus. And Emily is going to teach us or tell us the story, the history of mechanical aids to breathing, which I think is going to be very interesting indeed. Emily will share her screen. She's got a PowerPoint presentation to put before us. So welcome, Emily.
Yes, hi. When I go on to share screen, it goes host disabled participant screen sharing.
Ah. Let's see what I can do about that.
Yeah, that's got to be you, Susan.
Okay.
Sorry.
It was easy in practice, wasn't it, when we had the same?
Try now.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Phil's got his video still on. Let's just get the video. There we go. She's there.
Righty-ho. Yes, so hello, this all seems remarkably odd. So as Susan said, I'm previously, before working in the shop, I was a consultant in paediatric anaesthetics and intensive care. But like all paediatric anaesthetists in the UK, I trained in adult intensive care and anaesthesia as well. So, and the two areas overlap. Instead of having to start the talk with conflicts of interest, I'm going to start actually with some apologies. The original idea was from Susan, when she approached me, was to see if we could get someone from the Oxford vaccine team to come and talk about their area. But although agreed in principle, when it came to the timing, it couldn't have been any worse. And most of the vaccine team are working sort of 23 hours a day doing their data. So at the last minute, I suggested that I could give a talk about ventilation, as that has been something that has been reported on a lot. And in fact, I think quite rightly, intensive care has been reported on more than probably before. So while I'm apologising to everyone for the lack of the talk on vaccines, I'm going to add in a few, firstly to the linguists, because of the terrible use of a mixture of Latin and Greek-based words in medicine. I have to apologise to the engineers, because we're going to touch on, but really not go into, some quite complex concepts of flow and pressures, resistance and mechanics. But any physiologist, because this is a huge simplification. Modern historians I put down first, but also the ancient ones as well, because it's a bit of Wikipedia history, I'm afraid. And also to IT professionals for all of the hiccups that are about to occur. I generally apologise to pedants, because I came from a pedantic family, and I will become very lazy in my terminology as the talk goes on. So I am going to introduce you to the terminology, I'm afraid, And I'm also afraid a little bit about the sort of ins and outs of breathing. So ventilation is what we're talking about, is really the movement of the gases, that's the air, into and out of the lungs. Respiration, which is a word which is often used interchangeably with talking about ventilation, is actually more complex and relates to the movement of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide wherever it is within the system, so all the way from the lungs right down to the cellular level. Ventilatory support just means devices to improve ventilation. Spontaneous ventilation is breathing by yourself, spontaneously. Artificial ventilation when we do it, and mechanical ventilation when it is done via a machine. So just to talk a little bit about normal breathing, because breathing is a good term to encompass everything. So it's difficult to get the right pitch with an audience that's very varied. But I did date a man who got a history degree from St. John's here in Oxford. And he did have a vague knowledge of where his heart was, but absolutely no idea where his stomach was. So I know from that experience not to take anything for granted. So the lungs sit within the thoracic cavity, or the chest, and are surrounded by the rib cage, clearly with muscles and skin over that. And then the diaphragm, which is also vital together with the rib cage, sits below the lungs and effectively cuts the torso in half between the thorax above and the abdomen below. The inside of the rib cage and the outside of the lungs are covered with a membrane that produces fluid. The two membranes are called pleura, and the pleura has fluid within it, a very thin layer, and that lubricates the two sides of this movement so that the lungs can expand and contract very smoothly and easily. And you'll know from various old novels and things about pleurisy, which is when that area is affected, is very, very painful. So when we breathe in, the volume of the thoracic cavity gets larger, and it's done this is done in two ways in the adult and the older child. The main mechanism being that the ribs move up, and when they move up, they also move out, and it's called a bucket handle movement, because if you can imagine you've got your bucket and up comes the handle, it gets wider and further out. The diaphragm is the biggest muscle in the body, is domed underneath the lungs, and when it contracts, it comes down, also making the whole of the chest cavity much larger. That creates the negative pressure, and the gas flows into the lungs. When you breathe out, pretty much everything relaxes, and the volume of the thoracic cavity reduces. It should be a passive procedure. You should just stop breathing in, stop, hold it a little while, breathe out. But when you start to become short of breath, when your lungs become very heavy, then sometimes you'll see people actually actively pushing gas out of the lungs. Once you've breathed in, the air goes down the windpipe or the trachea into a system of pipes, get progressively smaller, bronchioles, and they end up in what's usually described as a cluster of balloons. And each one of those clusters is a ventilatory unit. The balloons themselves are called alveoli, and this is just a little picture of how it drifts down. And the alveoli, or alveolus is the singular, is the part of the lung that is really most important in the exchange of the oxygen and the carbon dioxide, oxygen into the blood, carbon dioxide out. They're very tiny but vital. So as you breathe in, the alveoli open up and the oxygen and carbon dioxide, as I said, move from the blood to the alveolus and back again. Vital to the actual story of lungs when it comes to ventilation and how we manage very sick patients is that the nitrogen would normally stay within the alveolus, helping to keep it open. Nitrogen is not very soluble in water, and that's why it stays. Now, as you know from party time, when you try to inflate a balloon, when you start to breathe, it is incredibly hard to get the balloon to open up. Now, that really wouldn't be very good for us, because when we breathe in, we don't want to generate a huge, great negative pressure to try and open these balloons. And so the alveolus, again, is lined with fluid, and that has a special compound called surfactant that reduces the surface tension, so that the tendency for this little balloon to hold small is eased off a little bit, and it allows it to open and close smoothly with no difference in how much pressure you have to exert on it, depending on the size of the alveolus. The other thing that is critical and fascinating if you really get into this stuff is that within the ventilatory unit, each one of those alveoli will fill and empty at a different time within breathing. This results in us needing it to breathe over a long period of time. And when you breathe out over a long period of time, as well as all these alveoli open and close at different rates. In the general state of things, breathing out should actually take twice as long as breathing in. If you take the lungs out of the thoracic cavity, and hopefully you're never going to have to see this, the lungs in fact don't completely deflate. Some of the gas remains in the alveolus, again, important for trying to keep them open. And this happens because little small airways, the bronchioles right down by those little fluffy units, close before you have completed breathing out. And that allows some gases to remain in the alveolus, and the nitrogen will stay there. These small airways actually do close during normal breathing. And this, together with other factors within the lung, means that the distribution of ventilation is not completely perfect over the lung. And it's on top of that, it is not matched to the way that the blood flows either. And we'll get into the importance of that later. At the end of when you breathe out, the pressure in the lungs, in fact, is not returned to atmospheric pressure, because there is a degree of resistance created by the nose and the mouth and other parts of the airway. That resistance, as it were, backs up the air through the system, and that leads to what is called a positive end expiratory pressure, or PEEP. And the PEEP stops further airways from closing off, or larger airways from closing off, again making it easier for the gases to move in and out. I've already explained that the gases don't really move through the lungs in the absolutely perfect way. There are alveoli which have sort of been blocked off by the airway closing. All the oxygen has moved that can move, and they no longer contribute to any degree of oxygen into the blood. But there is also an effect of the fact that we at all times have some part of our lung higher than other parts of our lungs. And in the main, we talk about people who are standing up. And when they stand up, you have a problem of the blood supply pumping upwards or downwards. It tends to go downwards better than up. You have the issue of the gases actually rather like going up as well, but the mechanics of the diaphragm mean that the gases actually move down quite well. But overall, that's a horribly fast canter through a very complicated thing. Overall, it means that the blood supply and the ventilation are not matched with each other. And this is called a ventilation perfusion mismatch. And it is that lack of matching between the blood supply into the lungs and the gases moving in and out of the lungs that leads us to have an oxygen level even normally that is less than you would predict in a perfect situation. If you then mess about with that matching even more, or something happens in the lungs that changes the way that the blood and the ventilation matches, then the oxygen level falls lower and lower and lower. And it is the falling of the oxygen level that causes people to become short of breath. Carbon dioxide is just not so much of it, and it's much more soluble in water. And so generally speaking, isn't a huge problem, but not always. Right, so we can now take a big sigh of relief. Sigh, as you'll see later, is in fact sometimes important in ventilation. So that's all of the physiology done. So having explained how we breathe, logically, if you wanted to help somebody breathe, you would try and reproduce that mechanism perfectly, because we breathe nicely. And so you'd sit down and you would think, right, I want to stretch this rib cage out. I want to generate a negative pressure in the lungs that will suck in the gases and we'll be ventilating. And lo and behold, human logic won through, and there was the invention of the iron lung, or negative pressure ventilation, or negative pressure ventilator, in fact. Interestingly, an Englishman back in 1670 developed the theory, and then we do a lot of moving between the English and the Scots. But the most important element for us really is in the 20th century, and with developments that are driven very much by repeated polio epidemics. And in polio, a certain number of people will get some of their muscles paralyzed, and some of those people will have their breathing muscles paralyzed. So in 1928, in America, they developed a working version, the ducker, and that was the commonest one that was used for some time, being first used in an 8-year-old child with polio. 1934, the first UK design by a Scotsman, and that was then first used later that year, first used in the United Kingdom, and was used in Aberdeen for a 10-year-old with polio. But the American design was really the commonest up to this point. But in 1938, again, as a result of a polio epidemic, Lord Nuffield looked at the situation and thought, right, well, same as they did here for COVID, I can turn my hand to developing a ventilator. And he did, and he produced 700 ventilators out of the Cowley works back in the 1930s. By the epidemic in the United Kingdom in the 1950s, there were actually only 7 iron lungs, or the Nuffield iron lungs in the UK, despite the fact that they were actually produced at 1/13 of the cost of the US, which is usually the opposite way around. Pivotal to ventilation, and the thing that's most famous for us as anaesthetists, is the polio epidemic in the 1950s in Copenhagen in 1952. They had a 500-bed hospital. They had 7 negative pressure ventilators. One was a proper iron lung, and 6 is a thing called a cuirass, which is really only a miniature iron lung that just goes over the chest rather than the whole body. So not as effective, but it could be used. They had 3,000 cases of polio. 1,000, that was in the hospital, and they had 1,000 cases that involved paralysis, and 300 or so cases involved the respiratory muscles. 70 of those patients were ventilated. So you can see already a hospital under pressure, and a pressure to think of other ways of managing this situation, with 7 ventilators not being enough. So how did they solve? They go on to solve the problem. Well, they started to use what is called positive pressure ventilation, and in that situation, what you're doing is you're placing something into the air, over or into the airway, usually down the windpipe, and you push the gases in and let them come out naturally. So it's an opposite way of pushing the gases in, same way of them coming out. In that particular case, in 1952, that was via a thing called a tracheostomy, which is where there is a hole made directly into the windpipe and the tube goes in that way. For the linguists, the Americans do say tracheotomy, which is technically the appropriate term. What they did was the tracheostomy tube connected to a delivery tube, and medical students working in teams would ventilate these patients over the full 24-hour period for however many days, weeks, or months that they required. And that was done simply by squeezing a rubber bag that inflates with the gases, and then you squeeze it again, let the gases out, and squeeze again. So a pretty repetitive thing to do, but it saved a lot of lives. and is really credited as being the birth of modern intensive care. So why move on to positive pressure ventilation? I will touch on later. Sorry, I got ahead of myself as usual. So tracheal tubes, the tracheostomy or tracheotomy, has been, or evidence of it has been picked up in artifacts from Egypt from 3600 BC. Hippocrates, he actually actively condemned the use of the tracheostomy, so it was clearly being used around that time for emergencies. His belief, the basis of the Hippocratic Oath that we in fact do not sign, is first, do no harm. That is meant to be the primary principle under which we operate, and his condemnation of tracheostomy relates to very large blood vessels around here and the risks. In 1000 AD, this gentleman produced the first illustrated surgical text, and the tracheostomy procedure was described in that, and that was the method they used in 1952. The endotracheal tube was advocated by Hippocrates, which I think I spelled wrong, and but not actually used in any way at that time. And the first record of a tube going from the mouth down into the windpipe was by an Arabic doctor who lived in that time period, so it was sometime in the latter part of that. There was some development in the 18th century for obstetric emergencies, but the main development was in the 20th century. And as is very common in medical advances, it was particularly taken up and developed and really refined to the equipment that we actually still use now, more than 100 years on, and was that development was brought on by the injuries in the First World War, where there were a lot of burns, a lot of head and neck injuries, and they needed to have the tube to go down in order to do the surgery. So back to when I jumped ahead, positive pressure ventilation became the thing from the 1950s onwards, and you can read for yourself. But the thing that pushed the doctors to thinking about the benefits of positive pressure ventilation was that you can have a thing called a bulbar palsy, when you have polio, and that paralyzes the muscles around the throat here and means that you can't swallow. And so they had patients who, with bulbar palsy, survived if they had a tracheostomy and had positive pressure ventilation, and they tended to die when they were being looked after in an iron lung. And that was primarily because the patient couldn't cough properly, but also couldn't stop anything from going down the windpipe that really shouldn't, so food or fluid or drinks, and then they would develop a pneumonia and usually die from that. So that was really the push. But there are a lot of advantages to the accessibility that you have to a patient when they can lie in a bed with a tube that's connected to a ventilator over there, as opposed to lying like this. But huge disadvantages. A lot of them I've listed down here seem to outweigh the disadvantages on the right, but the advantages were just very, very good. The thing that pushed subsequent development in the intensive care over the subsequent 50 or 60 years was the requirement of the patient to be sedated in order to have the tube and the ventilation. And that is a very big problem, because all of the sedative drugs that we have side effects. There's a lot of withdrawal. There's a lot of nightmares and some degree of psychosis that you can develop in intensive care. And also, as you're hearing from patients with COVID, a lot of muscle weakness afterwards. The other very significant problem is, yes, you don't breathe in food or drinks or stuff from above, but the bugs can get in down the tube, whereas you don't, generally speaking, get a lot of bacteria coming into your lungs if you have your normal airway. So this is a picture of a fairly classic sort of patient in intensive care. So as you can see, he's sedated, but the access to the patient is really fabulous. But there's no communication really, although we do talk to patients all the time on the assumption that they can hear, but as you can see, that's not a very comfortable situation to be in. What's happened since the 1950s? Well, very importantly, actually putting some moisture into the gases, because breathing dry gas is very bad for you. And we've worked very, very hard on trying to decrease the amount of damage that you can get to these very small little alveoli created by either excess pressure push into the lungs or by overstretching them by putting in too much volume. We're pushing really with all of the developments to have the patient breathing by themselves, still through the tube, but using their own muscles. The huge advantages for this is that if you can get that coordination, you can use less sedation. But I hope you could take away the message from the first bit that actually if you can breathe by yourself with a normal breathing mechanism, you can get much better oxygenation, that is much better levels of oxygen in the bloodstream, because the gases going in and out into the lungs will be better matched with the blood that's flowing around it. And in order to achieve these things, then a lot of work has gone into improving ventilator design. When I first did any intensive care in the early 1980s in the cardiac or heart unit in Southampton, we used a ventilator which had a bellows you could set for the volume you wanted. It had a metal device here, and you pushed the weight up according to how hard you had to push the gases in, and the weight pushed the bellows down, and then you waited for them to fill. And that was really very unsophisticated, and you would never see a thing like that even in an operating theatre now. The other thing that we have developed in intensive care are things that are rather unfortunately really called salvage strategies. It says everything you need to know. It's what you do when you have run out of any other ideas. And they tend to be things that do work. That's why they're done. But there is no study that demonstrates that the patient is better. The outcome of a population of patients is better if you do it. And that's again a big problem with medical research is it may be that something doesn't work for 90% of the patients, but the 10% of patients in whom it did are going to thank you. So salvage strategies are something that have been developed. And you will have heard about the second of these, but I put the first one up there, which was to try and improve the blood supply rather than the ventilation. And for that, we try using something called nitric oxide. I put it up there because Oxford was very pivotal in the development of the use of nitric oxide. So what you hear about a lot in the news and on the radio and various other discussions is a term unfortunately called proning. Personally, I would always said, can we turn them prone? But proning is what we call it. Now, the reason for that's basically taking someone from lying on their back, which is how you would normally be in intensive care, and turning them right over so that they lie on their front. They are on their back for 12 hours, on their front for 12 hours, and back again. It is a lot of work, but the reason for doing it has a lot of very good theoretical background for doing it. And as I was saying, the bits, the lower parts of your lung are always are potentially less ventilated because of the weight of the lung above it. When we breathe by ourselves and we're standing up, the diaphragm does a very, very good job at ventilating the bases. But when you're on positive pressure ventilation, you're not breathing by yourself, it's not involved. So the alveoli at the back, they collapse. Eventually all the gases will disappear from them, and that's a process called atelectasis. And so you have up to about 50% of the lung, that is all of the posterior lung, which goes down a long way at the back, just no longer ventilates. It's just solid and full of fluid and rather unpleasant. So the patient is turned over, and then over the period of time, the positive pressure will push its way into those alveoli, opening them back up, improving the ventilation. And then you do this to stop them from collapsing again. Now, the problems with it is that firstly, it's a salvage strategy. That means there is no very strong evidence of success. If you take a trial over a lot of people, it requires a huge amount of manpower if you're talking about doing it in an adult, especially when obesity is so associated with a poor outcome in COVID. And as you can imagine, with all of these people trying to coordinate to flip a patient who's possibly 150, 170 kilos over onto the front, it's very easy to pull all the tubes out, which have been giving you all of the treatment. And you have to cope with the anxiety of very low oxygen levels in the initial period. A very important thing that probably wouldn't be necessarily a thought about is pressure on the eyes. If you actually press back, if you lie on an eye, if you press back for a long period of time, then the optic nerve will become damaged. And that is clearly something that one doesn't want to do. Until the COVID-19 epidemic, the adult intensive care consultants just used to laugh at us because we did it a lot in paediatric intensive care. And they didn't do it at all. But now, of course, they've had to join in. But in paediatric intensive care, especially if you're talking a newborn baby, it actually only takes one person. It's just technically a lot easier to do. The other salvage strategy is actually something where you're actually trying to get the patient to sigh. It's important in normal breathing to have that occasional very large breath that helps open up airways, and that's been done in various different ways, which is taking a sigh of relief is always a good thing to do. What we ended up then with all of these developments, with lots of different ventilator manufacturers getting involved in trying to get to the point of the perfect ventilator. So you have a whole series of alphabetic spaghetti there. You've got IPPV, IMV, and then you can have them all plus something. You can have SIMV plus pressure support, that's PS. You can have SIPP and PSI. But the important things for this story are the PEEP, CPAP and BiPAP initials. Earlier on, I explained that it's important to have a pressure at the end of expiration to hold those airways open. And just again, one of these annoying technical things is it's PEEP when you breathe, but it's CPAP on a ventilator, continuous positive airway pressure. And that can be given through a mask rather than through an endotracheal tube. If you're going to have a mask tightly applied to your face to force pressure down into your airway, that actually is surprisingly easier to tolerate if that pressure is almost constant. It's very difficult to cope with if you've got that tightness of the mask and then the machine is actively trying to push the gases into your lungs. So if you're really lucky, then you can get away with no sedation. A patient can eat and drink to an extent, they can communicate, and the breathing is just easier because the pressure drops the work of the breathing. It is easy to give oxygen that way. It's surprisingly difficult to give oxygen without a tight system. So you can't give 100% oxygen to somebody in one of the normal face masks that you see. CPAP used very much in the newborn because of the very particular problems that they have and their strange way of breathing. And it led really from the CPAP to the very recent looking into the developments of the non-invasive ventilation, used again quite a lot by us in the paediatric intensive care and latterly in adult, and very, very much more so now with COVID. And this would be the situation that you would have. So you have to have this extremely well applied mask in order to push the pressure through the lungs or through the airways into the lungs. So this is the period of time where now in the 21st century is really the use of non-invasive ventilation. So you can get into that nirvana of ventilation where you don't have a sedated patient. They're not going to get weak from your drug. They're not going to get any withdrawal. They can breathe by themselves and they can balance their breathing much better than we can when we're trying to do it for them. But as always, there's never anything really new. And back in the 1940s, there were a lot of non-invasive ventilators. Some of them, like the iron lung, are more mechanical ventilators that you would recognize. But there were simple things like rocking beds. So if you have a paralyzed diaphragm, you can manage while you're awake, but it's not so easy when you're asleep. And so you go to bed on a rocking bed, and it goes tilts like that. And the weight of your abdominal contents when you head down pushes the diaphragm and helps the breathing. So there was a network of small hospitals, cottage hospitals, quite specialist hospitals throughout the country for looking after patients who had long-term problems from their polio or other reasons for having difficulty breathing. And they would use for respite care. But they were also, in fact, a network of them that allowed patients to travel through the United Kingdom for holidays. And there was a famous route for a patient who used to go to Cornwall from Scotland. And some of these hospitals and units were still in action in the mid-1980s. I visited a famous one in South London in 1984, which was very fascinating. In the 1980s, mostly used for patients who had a weak muscle. So now you're talking about things like you would have heard in the news, a process called Guillain-Barré, where muscles become paralyzed, those types of conditions. But in the 1990s, there was a lot of interest in using it in intensive care. In fact, I first encountered one in 1992 at the Royal Free, when one of the consultants from the Brompton came to try and see if there was a way of getting a patient to get through their illness without having to go on to positive pressure ventilation because of the problems that would have caused. And then later in the 1990s, more really into the 2000s, was the development of this particular mechanism, which is called BiPAP, or bi-level positive airway pressure. And very technical, for various reasons, you are simply breathing while gases are being pushed into your lungs at a variety of pressures like that, but you carry on breathing. And we can do that with all modern ventilators, and it's a very, very successful way of ventilating patients. But with BiPAP, it's easier, as I say, to have something that's almost constant than it is to have something pushing in and out if you're going to have a mask. And Boris Johnson would have had some variation on either CPAP or BiPAP, and there are 3 or 4 ways of delivering it. But if you can get a patient through this type of respiratory infection without having to put a tube down, then you are going to, in the main, be saving their lives. The reason for that is an element of ventilating patients that I haven't touched on at all, because it's definitely a whole other thing, which is the effect that putting positive pressure through the lungs has on how the heart performs. The heart is very dependent on blood returning to it from a low pressure system from outside the chest and then being pumped forward. And although the heart really does like to have a little bit of an afterload, a bit of pressure to work against, not when you add on the pressure we're putting in through the lungs. So that was my very rapid canter through the history of ventilation and how we have got to where we are. As always, there are thank yous. I would say thank you to Susan and the Friends of St Mary's for allowing me to give this talk, but it's the only time possibly that you will ever hear somebody we have to thank in the medical profession war and pandemics, because they are the things that really lead to these very rapid and very important developments. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily. That was absolutely terrific. And the first thing that I must say is that you really shouldn't apologise for anything whatsoever, because I'm hugely grateful to you for stepping in when all those vaccination experts are so busy with the media. And it's quite a reflection, isn't it, that we were only a few months ago completely obsessed by ventilators and mechanical ventilation, and people were making new types of ventilators all over the place, weren't there?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, one would pop up on the news every evening.
Yes. Yeah.
And now, of course, the media circus has moved on to vaccination.
Yes.
And we've forgotten all about this. I mean, I've learned so much this evening that I didn't know before, and I'm sure that many people will have questions for you. I'm just using the chair's right to muscle in and talk about something that, again, I'm really, frankly, pretty ignorant of. I was very interested by your reference to ancient Egyptian tracheostomy, and I should say I'm a classical archaeologist. I really don't go back to the 4th millennium BC, but and I'm a bit sort of skeptical. I mean, what did they find? Are these tracheostomy tubes or evidence from corpses?
It seems to be more from the sort of the paintings.
In the paintings.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Because
so I have to say, I can't say that I would really think that it's very likely, but they wouldn't be putting tubes down. They would. So we older people don't remember having diphtheria clearly, but we do remember diphtheria being something that people are absolutely terrified of. And in diphtheria, what happens is that the bacteria produces stuff that actually creates a membrane across the top of the trachea, so you can't breathe. And so something like that they would have been able to treat just by making holes in the throat. So it's not tracheostomy in the way that we think of it, but it is that idea that if somebody simply, if it's blocked from here, you get into the windpipe. So I think it's conceivable, but yes, who knows?
I mean, I have to say, what I do know is that 3600 BC is the pre-dynastic period in Egypt. It's just before the pharaohs muscle in and take off. And it's an extraordinarily dynamic period when they are inventing writing systems, producing monumental buildings, making extremely beautiful and utterly useless objects, all of which are signs of rapid advances in civilization. So I'm fascinated to hear that. Now, I'm sure there have got to be some questions for you. Does anyone have a question for Emily? I see a lot of applause for Emily, which is great.
Oh, we got Greg.
Greg, you will need to unmute yourself. Greg?
Okay, how about that?
Yes.
Good. It's a question. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that survival rates have been improved enormously from the early days in March and April compared with now. To what extent is that because of the improvements in ventilation that you talked about, as compared, for example, to drug treatments like dexamethasone and so on and so on?
Yes, that's an interesting question. No, it's a good question. I suspect it's probably a bit of everything, really, to be honest. It's so dexamethasone or giving steroids to people on intensive care when they're very sick has been something we've done over decades, usually as a salvage strategy. So I think that I personally think it's probably more likely that we just got better at keeping people off ventilators.
Right.
Because actually the way to improve survival is to keep you off a full-blown positive pressure ventilator.
Okay, well that leads to the second part of the question. Is the aim of the ventilation basically to keep people alive until their bodies can overcome the infection or the virus or whatever?
Yes. So it's one way to sort of think of intensive care is actually thinking of it as an intensive care, because actually when a patient's in intensive care, they're not there for enhanced treatment of the illness. The treatment of the illness is what the treatment of the illness would be wherever you are. You're there for the doctors and the nurses and everyone to be supporting all of your bodily systems, giving you the time for whatever the treatment or the natural process to go. So the ultimate would be, so we had a case of botulinum on the paediatric ITU when I first came here. And so in botulinum, you lose the receptors on the muscle, so you can't contract your muscles. They go, what are called motor end plates, they disappear. You have to wait for them to regrow. So you're ventilated for about 9 months. So yes, that's probably an